Welcome to Beyond the Grave, where darkness and the unknown collide. Join us on a spine-tingling journey through the chilling realms of the supernatural. Prepare to be haunted by eerie tales, ghostly encounters, and the unexplained mysteries that lurk in the shadows. Subscribe now, if you dare, and let's unravel the secrets that lie beyond the grave together. Hope you would enjoy the 1-hour scary story compilation on our channel. Subscribe our channel, and press the bell icon for more disturbing and chilling scary stories. Another chirp drifted into the room from outside. The window was open again. It hadn't been 10 minutes since Jacob had slammed it close. He stared at it in the front yard beyond, where the grass had become an ugly orange-brown, and thought of how exposed he was. Anything could get in once the latch has been swiveled open. The thought made his bones tighten. Sniffling and hacking, he got up from his chair to close it again. He was getting sick. It was the tail end of fall, and all of the leaves that had been in the trees were on the ground, golden and deceased. In the mornings, frost had started to form on the roofs and hoods of cars, and the grass had become brittle. It crunched underfoot at every step. It was the only sound Jacob focused on as he tramped across his backyard, checking for signs of the intruder. But he hadn't been outside to check in 3 days. For him, it was no longer safe to do so. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a normal high school kid. He did everything one would expect of a lively senior: weekend boozing, class skipping, and the occasional after-school slice at Yucca Steve's Pizza Palace. Everything seemed to be just as it should have been on a perfectly sunny Wednesday morning. That day, Jacob had slept through his alarm and lay in bed as his parents engaged in their usual coffee ritual in the kitchen. They poured it, steaming and black, into their enamel mugs and grimaced as they took it in. Shrugging on their coats, they roared off in their respective vehicles, leaving the boy alone in the house. They worked in the city and wouldn't be home until late, so when he finally woke up and found that it was past noon, he decided to shirk school and take his time getting ready to cruise out to the strip mall. He slipped out of bed and walked over the cold wood floor to his bathroom, where he brushed his teeth for nearly 10 minutes. As he did so, he stared into his eyes. They looked vapid, like a pair of opaque swamps with swirling bog bubbles at their centers. He spat a bloody soup of toothpaste and plaque into the sink and dried his mouth with a towel. There were no clean shirts in his closet, so he plunged a hand into a mountain of worn clothes next to the footboard of his bed and retrieved a shirt and his favorite pair of jeans. Once dressed, he proceeded through the hallway and the living room into the kitchen and whipped the freezer door open. Raspberry tarts were his favorite, and he was in luck. There were 5, so he took them all out and stood in front of the toaster, heating them in cycles until they were in a steaming stack on his plate. He filled a glass of milk to complement them and brought his bounty, teetering, to the coffee table in the living room. With a latent finger, he pressed the power button on a remote sitting on the table. The television crackled to life with howling sports. He was disheartened to learn that his favorite football team had lost. It was a very important thing to him. Like most sports fans, he didn't realize that he was volunteering his heart to be torn in two with each ignoble defeat his idols encountered. Jacob sneered, flipped to the music channel, and wolfed down his tarts. If he had been more aware, he might have heard the tap that occurred at each window in the room, one after the other, every 2 seconds. And the chirp. 30 minutes later, his stomach was full. He slipped into his shoes, grabbed his board, and left through the front door, kicking it closed behind him. It was only 2:15, but it seemed unusually dark. The few shredded cotton ball clouds didn't account for the depth of it. He jogged out into his front yard and almost threw his board down to roll away, but some dark, crouching thing at the far end of the street caught his eye as he neared the curb. It was standing behind a sycamore in the Jamesons' yard. It looked like a pure shadow, its head indeterminable. A light wind was ruffling a row of hedges just behind it, which appeared to agitate the figure. When it wasn't looking over its shoulders or back down its side of the street, it seemed to be focused on Jacob. "Hey," he said. The shadow didn't react, but he thought he could hear a chattering rasp coming from somewhere deep in the thing's throat. He didn't like the sound one bit. "The fuck are you looking at?" His question went unanswered. The dark creature started moving back and forth, as if it were the native inhabitant of some far-flung island, doing a dance to invoke its gods. Jacob could feel sweat slicking on his temples and the hollow throb of his heart. He was getting the jam in a serious way. Suddenly, he wanted to beat it, to kill it before it could do something horrible to him. He took a few quick steps off the curb and started yelling, "Answer me, you little bastard, or I swear to God I'll..." But suddenly, the shadow was gone. It was like it had melted into the grass, spilled like a towering column of India ink. Utterly perplexed, Jacob could think of nothing else to do but jump onto his skateboard and light off down the street, leaving the shadow behind, odd and unexplained. He'd always thought better of following the whims of curiosity. He had seen too many scenes in horror movies end badly because of such indulgences. The wind blew his hair back into a rippling raven flag. He kick-flipped up onto a stairway railing on his way through the neighborhood park and grinded down into a manual at the bottom, screeching to a stop after landing it and yanking his fist down to his chest in celebration. A nearby kid whose face had been invaded by a spore-like smattering of acne gave him a thumbs up. He returned it graciously, beaming, and sped off down another hill. The whole time he rode through the streets, he consistently peered over his shoulder, just in case there was some black, gaping nightmare sprinting at his heels. He had the distinct sensation of being followed. The feeling was leaching joy from his bones. 15 minutes later, he arrived at the strip mall. Leaves were drifting around lazily in the parking lot, skidding against the concrete and rasping out a symphony. The air had grown slightly colder, and there was no one to be seen mulling over the storefronts or cars. In fact, every store appeared deserted. Jake felt uneasy and approached his final destination, Shikianda Arcade. Dropping his skateboard by the door, he shielded his eyes to counteract the obscuring reflection of the parking lot and peered in through the glass. He couldn't see any of his friends tapping furiously at plastic keys or yanking on joysticks. There was no cashier at the counter. All that he saw was an inky dimness and a few specks of complacent dust that hung immobile in the air. Something was wrong. The arcade was always bustling with activity. He tried the handle. At first, it wouldn't budge, but on his fifth tug, Jake wrenched it open with unexpected ease. It swung past him and smacked into the adjacent wall. He stepped inside, peering cautiously down the aisles of game cabinets and growing all the more anxious as he worked his way toward the back. He figured he might at least find Midday Fred, the day janitor. He was always in the back in the afternoons, chewing on his dirty beard as he toiled between slimy, desperate teens. But to Jake's surprise, there was not a single sweep of a broom or rustle of a garbage bag when he neared the rear corner. Even after pushing on the lever to open the maintenance room door, he encountered nothing but a continuation of solitude. He was utterly alone, and each step he took became louder than the one before as the seconds of realization passed. It was unnatural for it to be that quiet at the strip mall, where everyone came to skip school and enjoy the days of their youth to the last drop. In a panic, he called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" At all. But silence was his only answer. He felt the sudden urge to leave, to go straight back home to his warm room. His safe, comfortable bed was thronged with comic books and stiff socks. He started back toward the front door at a quickened pace, but after passing the restrooms halfway to the exit, he heard a squeaking and stopped, supposing that he had stepped in water. The noise continued, though. It wasn't quite a squeak. It was fundamentally different, but recognizable to him. Images were conjured in his mind of childhood, chasing butterflies through a park. Chirp. Blue jays. Definitely not in here, he said to the darkness. Where do I recognize that sound from? Chirp. Dread was coiling up in the pit of his stomach, like a lead boa constrictor. He knew suddenly that something had been stalking him from the moment he walked in. Whatever it was, it continued to emit the queer chirp, just a row over from where he stood. "That's fucking it," he said, and he sprinted for the door. He refused to look back, but he could hear the sound of hard, narrow feet beating against the threadbare carpet mere feet behind him. Broomsticks on ceramic tile, his stalker's chirp had turned into a low, whirring whistle that might have sounded like a cat purring after having eaten one of those small plastic Casio pianos he used to play with when he was younger. The thing, whatever it was closing the distance between them. He could feel something like whiskers or antennae lightly grazing his shirt. When he reached the door handle, he jammed it forward, burst out into the open parking lot, and continued to run for several yards. He could no longer hear the thing's horrifying tone at his back, so he slowed to a jog and then walked in circles for a few moments. He stopped and doubled over, panting. It had gotten even darker outside, and great viscous clouds, pregnant with rain and winking lightning, had come rolling in from the south. He didn't see any cars on the road. The parking lot was still bereft of any sign of life. He scanned the broad black street from end to end, rubbing his neck and sniffing snot back into his nostrils. It had grown quite cold. Freezing specks of rain began to stipple his scalp. He turned around to face the buildings. Horrified, Jake remembered that his skateboard was still on the sidewalk. He'd have to go back and retrieve it before he could leave, and sure as shit, "I'm getting the fuck out of here," he thought to himself. But the cost of such a feat caused his heart to quicken. He wasn't sure he could make himself do it. Keeping low, he slinked toward a nearby car and stared over its hood at the arcade. Everything seemed very still. It was a trap waiting just for him. He stayed frozen, observing the prospect of returning for nearly 15 minutes before deciding that he just couldn't do it. Sighing deeply, he turned his back on his board and left. His lips were trembling. Hardly able to take a step without surveying his entire panorama, he traversed the streets back to his house but avoided the park. It seemed to him that passing through there was a death wish, that it was the perfect place to become prey. He didn't allow himself to blink until he stepped foot on the wilted grass of his lawn. Once inside, he locked every window and bolted every door. He didn't grasp the entire gravity of his situation then and there, but that would be the last time he left the boundaries of his home. The following weeks were a nightmare. The horror wasn't caused by being constantly under siege, but because nothing happened even though the threat remained palpable. He could feel the aerated poison sinking into his lungs. The furthest he would travel from his refuge was the curb on the street and the boundaries of his yard. His parents never came home. Even though he rarely saw his neighbors to begin with, they were most definitely out of the picture after the chirping had started. He wanted desperately to know what was happening to him, but the simple fact was that if he left in search of answers, he would surely die. Sometimes, just as he was falling asleep with one of his favorite CDs playing silently through the stereo by his bed, he would hear a rising chorus of chirps in the distance. The din wasn't loud enough to bring him out of his hypnagogic state, but his skin grew lousy with goosebumps. It sounded like a continuous, muffled shriek, like a beautiful byproduct of mass torture. Then, one day, it came for him. He woke up, and the window was ajar. A cold wind was funneling into his room and rushing across his body. It was 6 a.m, during that strange interim between night and day where the entire world is a flat wash of gray, and if a person hasn't slept, horribly alien thoughts come to mind. Chirp. Jacob heard it unmistakably, just outside of his room, under the windowsill. Something was there, and all that kept them apart was half a foot of sheetrock, wood, and vinyl siding. He couldn't breathe. The follicles on his scalp were tightening. It seemed like the external world was being sucked away through the hole in his wall. Getting up slowly, he slid his legs across the sheets and placed them carefully on the floor. He rose, and every 3 seconds, stepped closer to the noise. There was no retreating into the hallway or the bathroom. He knew that to turn his back on the thing outside was to perish without knowing. The gusts of wind that spewed in at him as he drew closer caused his nipples to harden and shrink. He held himself tightly in his bare arms, his teeth chattering, and squinted against the cold. It took him 5 minutes to reach the window. The suspense was pulling his skin taut over his bones, as if it were a Civil War drumhide. He stuck his head out, and there was nothing there. Ducking back inside, he whirled around to make sure nothing was standing at his back and slammed the window closed. With the whisper of the lock sliding back on its groove into the class, the portal was closed. He had a coughing fit. He was in a tomb. Jacob stormed into the living room, lashing the walls of the hallway with the belt of his robe as he went. The chirp was becoming more frequent. He couldn't escape it, and the fact was beginning to eat away at him. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was nearly empty. He had used up the last of the sandwich supplies 2 days before. Staring at the barren, chilled shelves, he wished that his parents had gone to the grocery store before blinking out of existence. He would have liked a couple of tasty snacks before facing his doom. He settled for a meal of 6 frozen Navy Kids chicken nuggets, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before his end came to him. Whatever was outside had started to follow him around the house, no matter where he went. It would chirp sometimes in the midst of absolute silence, just to make him jump. He hadn't taken a shower in a week for fear that the stalker might take such an opportunity to waltz inside and get a peek at him before sinking its teeth into his supple flesh and making a meal of him. The dining room table was gleaming from the overhead chandelier as Jacob sat at its head and stared at a dated newspaper from the morning of the 16th. There was a tap on the window, just behind him. He turned dubiously in the chair, rolling his eyes and shifting his body so that he could see what had made the noise. As soon as the wooden frame entered his peripheral vision, however, there was an implosion of glass shards. The thing was upon him. It had Jacob pinned to the table. He stared into its crystalline black eyes. They were lidless orbs set deep into a dovey white head, if a head could even be considered. More like a malformed sculpture from a kindergarten art class. A scripture direct from hell. It had 7 appendages. 6 of them seemed to be its legs. The 7th extruded from its back through a crop of fungal air sacs. They inflated and deflated intermittently with no obvious rhythm. It was tipped with a terrifically sharp barb that seemed to be leaking a dark purple liquid down its shaft. The creature had a ragged maw just below its eyes. It imposed its putrid breath all over his face. He tried to speak to it, but before his words could amount to much more than a weak rattle in his throat, a shrill chirp blasted out of it and slammed his skull down onto the wood. Its legs began to rattle in their joints. The barb jutting out of its back was curling around its neck and arching. The creature was deciding whether or not to impale him. Jacob tilted his head to look around for something to beat it off of him. Just inches from his head was a fallen jag of crystal from the chandelier that had hung above the table minutes before. The thing was leaning in close for some sort of death kiss when Jacob snatched the glimmering fragment and sank it deep into the nape of its neck. It belched a screech that made Jacob's head feel smaller, as if it had begun to fold in on itself like possessed origami. He was close to passing out, but the survivalist in him realized the momentary reprieve for what it was. A chance to wriggle free and fortify himself in his bedroom. He had a solid pine Louisville slugger propped in the corner just to the left of his door. He was imagining just how good it would be for pulverizing the gooey bastard's skull. He slid out from beneath the trilling horror and rolled off the side of the table. Even as he slammed against the dining room hardwood, he could sense tension at his rear. The thing was regaining its poise and reacquainting itself with its target. Jacob pawed at the floor while pushing himself forward with a few clumsy lunges. He was deafened by the buzzing din of insect wings. The creature was already at his heels. Within a few horribly distorted seconds, the million threads of each second forming a weave that pulsated and churned back and forth, Jacob crossed the threshold of his bedroom. He swiveled on his heels and rammed the door into its jamb with his shoulder. Shortly after, he could hear a solid, violent impact on the other side. The thing had flown headlong into a sudden dead end and was likely dazed. taking a chance on it. Jacob grabbed the baseball bat and whipped the door open. The creature's legs had given out and splayed at its sides. The shrill tones it had been emitting were replaced by a confused whirring, coming from deep inside its body. It was a writhing black mass of twitches, its white Play-Doh head bobbing merrily. Jacob took no time to study its ghastly form, however. He simply brought the bat down onto it. Repeatedly. 50 swings later, there wasn't much of the thing left for him to observe. He released the bat and knelt, panting. Immediately, the smell of the thing's fluids assaulted his nostrils and made him fall dumbly back into his room on his ass. He scrambled up onto his feet, enraged, and skirted the abomination to make his way to the kitchen. Digging around under the sink, he found a box of scouring powder. He rejoined the deceased creature and dumped a crystalline white mountain on top of it, then edged his way back into his room and collapsed onto his bed, letting out a shuddering, horrified sigh. Exhausted and drained, Jacob prayed in garbled whispers, anointing the ceiling with wasted breath. The air draped the scent of extraterrestrial decay over every surface. Sleep found him. It was hours later when he awoke. The world beyond his window had become orange with the rays of the sun. He noticed with disquieted clarity that he could no longer hear the blue jays singing as he had only a week before. When he sat up, he heard a sickly squelch, and looking down, observed lengthening tendrils of clear slime oozing off of his back. Panicked, he leaped up and ran into his bathroom. In the mirror, he beheld the worst image of his short, miserable life. There were colonies of pustules expanding and collapsing rhythmically on his cheeks and forehead. He opened his mouth to scream, but the moment his lips parted, a green, chunky mess delivered itself from the captor's cavity into the porcelain. With a dawning delirium, Jacob recognized the faded gruel as his tongue, disintegrated and sedimentary in his head. It had rotted while he slept. Instead of screaming himself hoarse, he had a sneezing fit, but with each violent "ah-cue," a bold crimson jet misted the porcelain bowl. The blood that hadn't evacuated itself was running down his throat, and when he vomited it out, most of his teeth wrenched free in the downpour. They were floating in the piss-smelling water of the toilet among chunks of the chicken nuggets that he had nuked and eaten that very morning. "Oh God," he screamed. "Why? What made me sick?" 5 hours later, Jacob was cringing like a shrimp on the floor of his parents' bedroom. His skin was a gruesome shade of green, glinting with ichor as some inner slime pushed its way through his pores. He was rotting alive. He had staggered around the house during those hours, searching for medicine. There was nothing that he thought might help him. But even so, he swallowed 6 different kinds of vitamins and every cold and flu capsule he could find. After the doom settled in, he contented himself with moaning and beating his fists on the walls. The skin on the sides of his hands had been flayed, revealing the hamburger gristle beneath. Entering one room, his eyes flickered over the furniture with gut-wrenching familiarity. He'd run a circuit of the place at least 20 times before stumbling into his parents' room and collapsing. The muscle fibers in his legs began to liquefy. There were jagged puddles of dark green and orange fluids crowded around his laboring form, soaked into the carpet. His body spewed them out of various newly formed holes in his chest and back. His mental faculties were beginning to slip away when the door to the hallway opened. A dark humanoid midget stepped in. Dark, actually, wasn't quite precise. It was beyond darkness. It was like a howling body-shaped hole in midair that was sucking light into it, a walking singularity. It chattered to itself, taking infinitesimal steps toward Jacob as he stared up at it. A vague thought rose to the top of his brain like a bubble in a glass of water. That was the thing hiding behind the sycamore in the Jamesons' yard the day this all started. Ever so slightly, his eyes began to widen. He tried to wrench his body across the carpet to create distance between himself and the whistling anomaly from beyond, but the moment he squirmed, he could feel his spinal cord separate from itself like a saturated strand of toilet paper. He screamed and literally coughed up part of his lung. The dark being approached him and crouched, tilting its head in an almost loving way, as if it cared. Then Jacob saw one of the last and most horrifying sights of his life. Multiple tentacles leered out of its back and began to form balloon-like spheres at their tips. The spheres then began morphing into recognizable faces, all of his friends and his parents. They gaped down at him and moved their mouths open and closed, but produced no words. Tears were spilling down his cheeks as he looked on. The thing bent over him, planted its hands on Jacob's head, and pulled him closer. He could feel the skin on his face loosening itself from his skull and fluttering away in sail-like flaps. His scalp was splitting, and the bone beneath was crisscrossed with jaunty, scribbling cracks as it ruptured from the force. He was all but gone. A goofy smile crossed his face. He began to slobber, but tears still welled in his lower eyelids. What a strange way to die, he thought, giving the thing a humorous wink. When he reopened his eye, it burst, and its inside sluiced out of the socket onto his collarbone. The being embraced Jacob and sucked his skeleton clean with its vacuum skin. Moments later, his face sprouted out of its back on another one of its black, writhing stalks. It had a wan but jubilant expression as it bobbed. The Jacob simulation's eyes gazed out of a window on the west wall and watched as the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky with a shimmer of bloody dusk shine. A few chirps sounded out, then many more, rising into a shrill opera in the distance. Cliff was finally in the small Louisiana town of Crescent Falls that he had sought out. It was an unassuming rundown town that normally wouldn't attract anyone. But Cliff was not just passing through, and he wasn't your average traveler. Cliff had a penchant for seeking out urban legends and myths, and he felt he had hit the jackpot. It was such a compelling legend that Cliff had decided to drive to Louisiana from his home in Arkansas. Cliff had gone to several so-called haunted locations with little to show for them. He always managed to capture some odd image or sound on his camcorder, but it was nothing of any significance. Cliff hoped he would find something worthwhile this time. He had stumbled upon the legend of a bog dubbed Suicide Bog by the locals several months ago. After further researching the topic, he decided it had some credibility, enough to warrant a trip. He had read tales of ghostly figures, eerie whispers, and past deaths in the bog, which had been both hallowed and feared by the local Native Americans. The townspeople of Crescent Falls had set their eyes upon the woods for various reasons, which culminated in the horrific massacre of 7 loggers in 1923. Since then, several more mysterious disappearances have been linked to the place. Cliff was now in sight of his intended first stop, the town's warehouse. He had already arranged to meet with a contact he had met online, who told Cliff he would get him in touch with a local man who had extensive knowledge of the bog's history. The warehouse was as derelict as the rest of the town. Cliff parked at the warehouse and was immediately accosted by a middle-aged man standing outside the warehouse. "Are you Cliff?" the man asked. "Yes," Cliff responded. The man motioned for Cliff to follow as he entered the warehouse. Men worked as the two walked through the warehouse and up a flight of stairs to the foreman's office. The man knocked. After a few seconds, the door opened to reveal a decrepit old man. "Cliff, this is Everett. He'll tell you all you want to know. I have to get back to work now." The man said this as he briskly walked back into the warehouse. Cliff took a seat as Everett lit a cigarette and sat back in his chair. "So, you want to know about the old suicide bog?" Everett wheezed out. It was clear his lungs were bad. "Yes. Please, I'm very interested in this legend." Cliff replied, "I guess you are if you drove all the way from Arkansas. And it ain't no legend. It's very real." Everett responded. Cliff merely nodded and took out his notebook, ready to jot down what Everett told him. Everett muttered under his breath about Cliff not believing him before beginning his narrative. In between coughs, he began talking about the bog's use as a place for rituals and burials by the Native Americans. The local Indians used the bog for rites of passage. Everett began. It was a spiritual place. However, eventually the tribesmen began to feel the presence of a malevolent being. They ceased to enter the bog. They felt it was no longer their place to go and left it alone. What sort of being? Cliff asked. I'm getting to that, Everett said as he took a drag on his cigarette. Avoiding the place wasn't enough to keep the being, who would later be known to the tribe as the mother of the bog, at bay. The whispers and voices could be heard. The closer you got to the bog, and the foggier it was, the more powerful and compelling the voices were. That must be related to the disappearances and the murders in 1923, Cliff said as he wrote down several notes. Everett nodded. Yes. The voices demanded sacrifice, to be fed flesh, blood, and sinew. Some were able to resist the commands. Others were not. Over the years, many tribesmen, under the influence of the voices and fog, wandered into the bog. They were never seen again. Cliff eyed Everett intently as his interest in the story grew. It was all bullshit. It had to be, but it still succeeded in sending a chill down his spine. After a few years, Everett continued, the tribe reached an agreement with the mother of the bog. They would leave their dead in the bog as long as the voices stopped luring their people to their demise. The deal worked, at least until the tribe was displaced. The settlers who moved here did not bury their dead in the bog, and the voices gradually grew stronger. There were a few disappearances here and there, but people picked up and left frequently, so nothing was really thought of. Until 1923. The murders happened then, Cliff stated. Yep, Everett stated. A group of 10 loggers began working in the bog and surrounding woodlands. My grandfather was the only one of the 10 to come out unscathed. Cliff's interest reached new heights as he heard this. The 10 of them were creeped out from the start. Something wasn't right, and they knew it. Everett said. The men spoke of their concerns, but their concerns were not heeded. It grew hard for the men to keep track of reality, but one logger in particular grew increasingly disturbed. What happened? How did your grandfather manage to survive all of this? Cliff asked as he continued to write in his notebook. Christopher Ross was the logger who grew disturbed. One night, he began chasing a figure that only he saw. He described the figure as a hazy, otherworldly woman. Immediately after that, he began speaking of feeding the mother of the bog. He started bloodletting every night, to the alarm of the other men. Every night, while muttering about feeding the mother, Christopher would cut the palms of his hands and watch the blood drip into a nearby stream. Jesus, Cliff stated. Christopher was still a reliable worker, so the men neglected to do anything other than cease any interaction with him that wasn't necessary. Christopher's mutilation reached new heights after a few days, though. Everett said. Just days before the massacre, Christopher cut off his ears and nose. He threw them into the stream as a sacrifice to the mother. He was about to cut off his lips as well when he was stopped by the other loggers. Cliff was shocked. He had not heard such a disturbing account of the place online. He was beginning to have second thoughts about visiting the bog. I never heard of such a graphic account. Cliff said. All I heard of were ghostly figures and sounds. It gets worse, Everett said grimly. Christopher was restrained and taken back into town. He screamed angrily at them for interfering with his feeding of the mother. He was committed to a psychiatric facility. His delusions and self-harm stopped shortly after he left, but he maintained that the voices and hazy beings were real. He was never released. He died in the mental hospital some 20 years later. I'm guessing the murders happened next. Cliff said. Yes, my grandfather was lucky. His wife, my grandmother, was pregnant with my father at the time. A day or two before the massacre, my grandfather came into town to be present when his wife gave birth. He was in town for 3 days. He returned to the loggers' camp to find it a bloody mess. 7 of the loggers were horribly dismembered. None of them were completely recovered. Many of them had lost body parts that went unaccounted for. Some of the injuries were self-inflicted. Others weren't. The 8th logger, Jacob Bishop, was gone. They never found a trace of him. Some people think he killed the other 7, and others think he too was a victim. My grandfather was sure that whatever Christopher saw killed the others. He was also sure that Bishop also fell victim to the attacker. My God, but wasn't there another incident in the bog after that? Cliff asked. Everett nodded as he coughed several times. He lit a cigarette off the end of the old one and continued. 56 years ago, and 32 years after the massacre, the daughter of the town's sheriff disappeared in 1955. I was 10 years old then, and I remember it well. She had been playing near the bog when she heard the voices. At first, her parents thought she had an imaginary friend, but it soon became clear something was wrong. She began acting strangely and had cuts on her arms. Before her parents could get help, she wandered off, presumably into the bog. I'm guessing no one saw her again. Cliff said. Right. Everett replied. She probably met the same fate as the others who disappeared, whatever that may be. The sheriff became increasingly disturbed after she was gone. He began sitting by the stream in the bog, nearly catatonic. He would only give brief, terse answers. He believed he could hear her voice, and that she would return to him if he waited. Maybe he did hear her voice in the fog. Maybe that damn thing out there is capable of that kind of manipulation, Everett mused. What happened to him? Cliff asked. He stopped taking care of himself. He basically stopped eating or maintaining himself. He was terribly pale and underweight by the time he killed himself. He left a note saying that the voice had told him that only by feeding the bog could he see his daughter again. He drowned himself in the stream. Everett stated. His case sounds similar to one supposed ghost I read about in the bog. Cliff said. It is. A few people have reported such encounters. My grandfather, my father, and I all came to believe that the soul of anyone who died or was laid to rest in the bog was claimed by it. We've only had 2 disappearances since then, as most people know to avoid the place. We can't even be sure those 2 fell victim to the bog. On fire nights, voices can still be heard in town. I think that thing uses the fog as its way of communicating with us. Everett finished. That was quite a lot of information. Thank you for your time, Cliff said as he went to leave. You aren't going to go check out the bog now, are you? Everett asked. He had a worried look on his face. No, Cliff lied. I'm serious, Cliff. Don't go. You'll just be another disappearance. Mike, the man who showed you in, told me about you. The bog is way out of your league, Everett warned. I won't go. Thanks for your help. Cliff said. It was a lie, of course. He hadn't come all the way down just to interview one man. He was going to try to document the bog. Cliff made his way through the warehouse and out to his van. Cliff entered his van and began going through the equipment he had brought. In addition to his camcorder, Cliff had packed a field recorder to capture sounds, a flashlight, a GPS, and a large pack of batteries. He had a mattress in the back of the van, so he could sleep without paying for lodging. Ignoring any hesitation that still remained, Cliff drove out to the road nearest to the bog. It wasn't a long drive, and he had already looked up the route. The road was worn and in need of work, with the wilderness slowly but surely reclaiming the space. In a few minutes, the roadside was more spacious, as Cliff came upon a clear area with a clear entry point to the bog. Just up ahead was a small bridge, which passed over a slow-moving stream. After taking in his surroundings, Cliff entered the tree line and made his way into the wilderness. Tonight, he would simply set up his sound recording equipment as a sort of reconnaissance in hopes of recording the alleged whispers. Tomorrow, he would actually explore the bog at night. Apart from the occasional bird, the bog was deathly silent. The vegetation was thick and impassable in many places. Many trees, old and overgrown with other plants, hung eerily low. Cliff could hear the stream still, but he could not see it from where he was. After walking for about 30 minutes, Cliff came upon some wetlands. Having decided this was a good place, Cliff went about setting up his recording gear and went back to his van. It was almost dark by now, so Cliff decided to settle down on the mattress in his van. It was very quiet and peaceful as Cliff lay on the mattress, nearly asleep. He was about to drift off when he heard a voice. He was unable to understand a single word, but it sounded as if a heated conversation was taking place in the woods mere feet from his van. As he strained to listen, he could barely make out the words "Among Us" and "Mother." Suddenly, more voices from the other direction could be heard. These voices were much calmer but still unintelligible. Growing increasingly unnerved, Cliff realized these voices sounded as if they were right outside his van. Unsure of what to do, Cliff laid there in a sweat, hoping the voices would go away. To his relief, the voices eventually subsided. However, Cliff could still hear voices in the distance every so often as he struggled to sleep. Cliff rose early and wasted no time fetching his recording equipment. He couldn't help but think he was being watched as he ventured into the bog and retrieved his equipment. Listening to the recordings, I initially thought they were nothing more than typical wilderness sounds. That began to change as voices, harsh and menacing, could be heard with increasing intensity. Much of it was unintelligible whispering, but it was without a doubt highly discomforting. Cliff thought about calling it quits. This was more than enough to call it a successful trip. However, Cliff wanted more. He wanted to physically explore the bog at night. Cliff spent the hours idly waiting until the sun began to set. He set out into the bog with his camcorder, GPS, flashlight, and batteries. The bog was even more surreal and creepy at night, with the dying trees and thick vegetation casting menacing shadows. As nightfall came, Cliff noticed fog appearing at his feet. Worried he might trip, he began walking much more carefully. The first hour or so was uneventful, although unnerving. As Cliff stepped over a fallen tree, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Snap out of it. Cliff told himself his eyes were playing tricks on him. They had to be. The sound of the stream was getting stronger. Cliff decided to approach it to see what sights the stream could offer. Keeping his camcorder up, he managed to get through a thick patch of brush. Cliff stopped dead in his tracks. Up ahead in the distance was a dark, hazy humanoid figure. Cliff's heart skipped a beat, but just as quickly as he saw it, it disappeared. "Come on, Cliff, get a grip on yourself," Cliff muttered. Cliff was really starting to freak out. Every shadow made him do a double take. He mistook objects such as stumps for people. As if he wasn't scared enough already, he could swear the whispers were back. All around him, low to the ground, Cliff could hear garbled voices of varying volume. However, every time Cliff shined his light or otherwise checked where the voices should be coming from, he found nothing. Every rational thought in Cliff's head was telling him to go back, but he wanted to capture more on camera first. As he continued to make his way towards the stream, he tripped on a root hidden by the fog. Cliff found himself face to face with a withered anorexic corpse. Cliff flailed and screamed. As he got up, though, the corpse was gone. Cliff was rattled. As he hurriedly walked from the spot where he had tripped, the path began to open considerably. In a few seconds, he was upon the stream, as well as the most frightening sight of his life. Just feet away from him, at the bank of the stream, sat a man. He didn't seem to notice Cliff. The man was terribly pale and emaciated. He was bald, with just a few strands of hair on his scalp. Cliff trained his camcorder on him for a few seconds before backing away. As he backed away, the man whirled around. The man's face was as emaciated as the rest of his body, with two sunken black orbs for eyes. Cliff froze, paralyzed with fear, as the man stood up. For several tense seconds, the man eyed him intently. Then he took a step toward Cliff, and another, and another. Cliff's mind screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place, unable to move. Without warning, the man cried out and lunged at Cliff. Reacting instinctively, Cliff raised his arms to defend himself. He caught both of the man's arms. "Please help. My daughter's missing. You have to help me. Make it stop," the man wailed. Terrified, Cliff pushed with all his might, sending the ghostly man tumbling onto his back. The man cried out as he landed. Finally finding his leg muscles, Cliff sprinted back the way he came, expecting the man to chase him. The man didn't seem to follow, but Cliff nonetheless sprinted, determined to escape this nightmare of a place and never come back. Cliff was frightfully aware that the whispers were becoming louder and more agitated. To his fear, he realized the fog was rising, and with it, the voices were rising. The fog was almost up to his waist now. Cliff had no choice but to press on, making his way back to the van as quickly as possible. Cliff stopped. On his path was another ghostly figure. This one paid no attention to him, passing right by him. It was still more than enough to send a shiver down his spine. The fog was rising rapidly. It was up to his chest now. The whispers were becoming stronger as he began to run back to his van more desperately than before. As Cliff continued running, he stopped to catch his breath. Almost instantly, the voices were louder and clearer than ever. As the voices assaulted him, the black, hazy figure from before appeared in front of him. Cliff could see it much more clearly this time. The figure was about 7 feet tall and all black with the exception of its glowing red eyes. "WH, what are you? What do you want?" Cliff stammered. After eyeing him silently for a few seconds, the being spoke in a deep, thunderous voice. "I am the mother of the bog. I want you to join me, my child. Feed me and join the rest of my children," the being boomed. "No," Cliff shouted. The being extended an arm towards him, causing Cliff to run. Cliff thought this had to be a hallucination from the fog. In a few seconds, he realized it wasn't. The being was nowhere to be seen, but Cliff had run away and gotten himself spun around. As he looked around to get his bearings, he saw multiple figures. They were all around him, circling him. They were walking slowly, like a shark circling its prey in the ocean. He shined his light on them, revealing dozens, if not hundreds of them. They all looked alike, their faces ashen and their eyes sunken, emaciated with pale, waxy skin showing nearly every bone. Cliff screamed and broke into a run. The beings shrieked in unison, shattering Cliff's ears as he ran, the beings hot on his tail. Worse, the fog was nearly nose level now. As Cliff ran, he inadvertently inhaled some of the fog. "Stay here. Don't be afraid. This is where you belong," said a voice in Cliff's head. "No," Cliff shouted as the thought left his head. He could hear the mob of beings chasing him. He didn't dare look back. The fog was still rising. He had to get out before the fog claimed him and made him want to stay. He had to climb a tree. It was the only way. Hopefully, he could wait it out until daylight, and hopefully these fuckers can't climb, Cliff thought to himself. Cliff began climbing the first tree he could reach. He went up one branch, then another, then another. Suddenly, he felt a vice-like grip grab his ankle. One of them had gotten him. Cliff almost fell into the horde of monsters, but was able to wrap both arms around a strong branch. He cried in pain as the nails from a hand dug into his skin, drawing blood. The fog was still rising. Cliff had no idea what time it was. He had to hope these things would vanish when the sun came up, if he could last that long. Cliff looked down. The things had swarmed the tree. They were staring up at him ravenously. If he lost his grip, he was a goner for sure. The fog was almost at Cliff's nose again. Cliff held his breath. The fog would drive him insane. He couldn't breathe in it. A minute passed. Cliff took a breath. He had to. His mind was immediately flooded. "Don't fight it, Cliff. This is your home. This is where you belong." The voice said, "No. My home is in Arkansas." Cliff screamed. "I am your mother, Cliff. I love all of my children. Stay with me and accept my love." The voice boomed. The voice was reassuring. He started to loosen his grip, only to immediately come to his senses and tighten his grip. "You're not my mother," Cliff shouted. He had to fight the urges. He couldn't give in. He had to hold on until sunrise. He held on for dear life. He could see the sun peeking over the horizon. This place didn't seem so bad. Surely there were reasons to accept this family, Cliff thought to himself. No, snap out of it. The fog is getting to you. Just hold on a little longer. Cliff told himself, but the mother is so welcoming, Cliff thought. He had nothing but a lonely life back in Arkansas. He should join his new family. Yes, this is my home, Cliff said to himself. He let go. He immediately screamed as he realized what he had done. However, Cliff didn't fall into the hands of a pack of demons. He fell to the ground with a thud. The sun had risen enough to drive the things away. He lay there, sighing in relief. As he lay there, relieved, something wasn't right. To his horror, Cliff realized a cloud had covered the sun. Cliff broke into a sprint as the beings reappeared, chasing him. He tore through the brush and wilderness with vigor. He could see the clearing. He was almost in the van. Cliff felt a handbrush against his back, but it didn't succeed in grabbing him. Cliff burst through the tree line. He tripped, but to his shock, the beings didn't follow. He looked. They stood behind the trees, staring at him with angry snarls. It occurred to Cliff that they most likely couldn't leave the bog. Not wasting any time, Cliff got into his van and drove back into town. Needless to say, this was the last expedition Cliff ever undertook. He showed the footage to Everett, who called him a complete fool. Cliff posted his footage online, but it was ultimately dismissed as a hoax by many, much to his chagrin. Cliff just hoped his investigation wouldn't inspire other people to seek out the bog. Well, you really screwed up this time, didn't you? You found a gnarly deal on a beautiful home that almost seemed too good to be true, and you jumped at it. And now that you've all moved in, you've started to notice some anomalies. You know the type. The spooky-dooky anomalies of the supernatural persuasion. Bumps in the night, doors opening and closing by themselves, auditory hallucinations of voices, and whispers. It's more common than you may think. But not everyone realizes the danger. These signs could be proof that some forsaken, lost souls inhabit your property. Maybe the previous grandmother self-immolated in the attic. Maybe dear old dad went suddenly insane and repainted the house with the blood of his children. Or mom tried seducing demons in the basement. If this sounds even vaguely familiar to you, and you are looking to the good old internet for help, then you've come to the right place. You see, I have this friend. Well, I had this friend named Nathan. A couple months ago, Nathan found a house for sale in southern Georgia. It was nestled along a remote stretch of woods just outside of Waycross. It was a historical area. An old colonial-style home, just under 5,000 square feet, 6 beds and 6 baths with white picket fences and a dozen acres. The quintessential American dream house. By all accounts, the price was unbelievably low. But after Nathan contacted the real estate agent, he found that the price that he had seen listed was indeed the price that was being asked. For most people, I imagine this would have raised some pretty big red flags, but Nathan was an idiot. The confident type of idiot who believed machismo was substantial for conquering all of life's obstacles. I know it's not kind to speak ill of the dead like that. Spoiler alert. But I'm just trying to give an accurate portrayal of the kind of person Nathan was. You know, the alpha male who hits on your girlfriend, lives at the gym, and probably spanks his knee for his own selfies. For people like Nathan, friend is really just another word for ego reinforcer. He was cocky and often let pride get the better of him. His wife, Janelle, was actually my ex-girlfriend from a while back. Bit of a skank, but practically a supermodel. They had 2 kids, Natalie and Mason, who were both spoiled brats. Again, I'm just trying to give an honest perspective on them, in hopes that we may all learn something from what happened. You see, what happened to Nathan, which I'll get into later, was something that I believe could have been easily avoided if only he had followed a few simple instructions. After the funeral, I got to pondering the matter and realized that what we all really need is a set of rules to follow if you believe your house is haunted. Let's begin. Rule number 1. When looking to purchase or rent a house, always ask for the history. Odds are, if a house is being offered way below market value, there is a very good reason for it being that way. Nathan didn't do this and thought that the under-market price was simply the universe handing him something he didn't really earn, as it often seemed to do. Nathan jumped at the offer, and within a few weeks, he and his family were approved to begin moving in. I volunteered to help them move in, and I'll be honest, the house was absolutely gorgeous. Things were great for them at first, but Nathan soon started noticing some odd occurrences. It started with this knocking sound that seemed to reverberate all over the house at odd hours. He said he could never seem to pinpoint where it was coming from, and it never seemed to originate from the same place twice. Eventually, he just chalked it up to the house settling, but that was just the beginning. Rule number 2. Trust your gut. Your home is the last place you should feel uncomfortable. If you get that inkling of discomfort in the back of your mind that never seems to fully dissipate, pay attention to it. It's probably your subconscious trying to warn you. Nathan tried ignoring these sounds, told his wife that it was just normal or the wind, and comforted his children when they felt scared. He had 2 dogs, Rusty and Sailor. Both of them were black labs, and both seemed to become very anxious after moving in. Nathan did his best to get medication to help the dogs relax, but it didn't seem to help much. That brings us to rule number 3. Along with your gut, you should also trust your pets. Animals have instincts far greater than humans. It's been said that man is the only creature who will sense danger and still wander into it. Animals have a sense for the supernatural, dogs and cats in particular. If you find them growling at what appears to be nothing or constantly staring into specific areas of the house, then pay attention to that. Odds are, they can see something you can't. Nathan told me that Rusty, the older of the 2 dogs, would pace the hall each night for hours. He said it was like he was standing guard over something. On more than one occasion, Rusty suddenly burst into a ferocious bout of barking and snarling. Nathan would come out into the hall, but he never found anything. He grew concerned for Rusty and took him to the vet, but the vet confirmed he was in good health. Meanwhile, Sailor, the younger dog, slept at the side of Mason's bed each and every night. The poor boy soon developed crippling nightmares that would torment him relentlessly, and Sailor seemed to sense it. Each time Mason would wake up screaming, Sailor would be there to try and comfort him. And that segs perfectly into our next rule. Rule number 4. Beware the nightmares. Young children are similar to animals in the way that they seem more perceptive to things that adults are not. This one can be difficult because there are many root causes of nightmares, including things like anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses. The telltale sign is whether your child suddenly develops them soon after entering the home. Poor Mason had absolutely horrific dreams, and night after night he would be tormented by them. He often spoke of the blurry man that came to him while he slept and whispered terrible things. He even said that sometimes he would see the blurry man while he was awake, but never more than a quick glimpse, and always in the shadows or outside in the woods. Nathan and his wife worried that perhaps Mason was schizophrenic, but multiple doctors confirmed this was not the case. They tried giving Mason sleeping pills, various supplements, and burning incense to help him sleep more peacefully. It worked for a while, until Natalie started having them too. Rule number 5. Try to determine what kind of spirit you're dealing with. If you see flashes of a small child running through the halls at night or orbs spiraling in the air, then odds are your ethereal neighbor is rather benign. Some people even discover they rather enjoy life with a spectral roommate and find their antics to be rather interesting. Most believe that spirits who pass away before completing what their soul desires will become stuck in a sort of purgatory. Many are scared, confused, and angry, but some, primarily young children, seem to be almost jubilant at times. Most of these are unnerving but altogether harmless, but then there are the other spirits. Rule number 6. If you or any member of your family develops inexplicable bruises, cuts, or lesions, do not take them lightly. This should be a massive red flag, and it is a very bad sign. If you feel as though you are being attacked as you sleep and wake up with unexplained scratches or wounds, then just get the hell out of the house, honestly. A malevolent spirit capable of inflicting physical wounds is not something to be trifled with. Odds are it's a demon, and honestly, that is the best case scenario. There are other non-Abrahamic related entities that could be responsible as well. They are very rare, but if encountered, well, I'm afraid even my handy set of rules won't be enough to stop them. Natalie and Mason suffered multiple scratch marks, wounds, and even a few bruises that almost looked like bite marks. Nathan's wife, Janelle, was also subjected to these attacks. The children's teachers at school began to notice and became quite worried for their safety. Obviously, their first thought was not paranormal, but rather that the children were being abused at home. Only when social services threatened to remove the children from his custody did Nathan finally agree to move them out of the house. Janelle and the kids moved in with her mother a couple of hours away, and Nathan was left all alone with the dogs. Rule number 7. Let people know what is going on. Yes, I know the thought of admitting to a close friend that you believe your house is haunted may be daunting, but it's usually better than the alternatives. The modern world rarely takes these claims seriously. We see ghosts in movies and video games, but when someone actually claims to have seen one, we aren't so quick to believe them. Technology and science have led us to believe we are safe. That is our folly, but it's also a topic for a different day. This is yet another rule that Nathan did not abide by. The worse things got for him and his family, the more secluded he became. On numerous occasions, he called the police, saying that he believed someone had broken in, but they never found evidence of it. Eventually, they even put him on a blacklist and warned that any further contact would result in legal trouble. Rather than tell his parents, brother, or any of his friends what was going on, he retreated into himself. He became fidgety and paranoid, at times refusing to return phone calls and texts from his loved ones. He just broke contact, and things only got worse. Rules 8 and 9 sort of belong in the same category, although one is a little more extreme than the other. Rule number 8. If you suspect something is up, it doesn't hurt to perform a cleansing. Like I said earlier, the modern world has little time to entertain the notion of ghosts and the supernatural. But that shouldn't ward you off. If you're unsure about whether your home is haunted or not, then a routine cleansing can do wonders for you. I'm willing to bet there are mediums and priests in your town that can get the job done. Even if you can't find anyone local, you can always go online and find instructions for yourself. It's not as effective that way, but it's better than nothing. Rule number 9. If you're really feeling as though you are in danger, get someone to perform an exorcism. It's a step that no one wants to take, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Priests and spiritual leaders are your go-to for these kinds of things. Even if you yourself are not religious, these people honestly do know how to help. There's some evidence that Nathan was attempting to do this, but it's unknown exactly why it didn't work out. Maybe he second-guessed himself and thought he could handle it, or maybe his ego took control once again. Nathan had been collecting evidence for a while and had amassed quite a stash of clues. He had audio recordings that relayed banging on the walls and footsteps in the attics. He took multiple videos, but none of them really showed anything except for the last one. And by that point, it was too late. In his journal, He also wrote that he experienced items in the house levitating on several occasions, but sadly, he had no recorded proof of this. Rule number 10, the big one. Whatever you do, don't try to antagonize the spirit. This should really go without saying, but angrily challenging the spirit or daring it to manifest is a really bad idea. But as you may have guessed, Nathan and his unlimited stream of testosterone decided to do just that. He got really drunk one night and began ruminating on all that had been happening. Nathan was always a skeptic, but even he couldn't ignore the psychological impact on his family, whether it was imagined or not. He realized his relationship with his children and wife was heavily strained, and his new house had become a place of hostility. This made Nathan very angry. So Nathan stood up and shouted at his empty house for the spirit to come forth and face him. He was met only with silence, and so he shouted again. Never once did the spirit answer his call. After a few more verbose challenges, he broke into a bout of laughter, probably believing himself to look ridiculous. Apparently not everyone who was watching felt the same, though. Nathan managed to stumble into bed not long after, and he was out cold within a couple minutes. Nathan had kept a security camera in his room in hopes of capturing proof, and that night he found something. At around 2:13 a.m., Nathan is seen beginning to stir in his sleep in the security video. He grunts and speaks briefly, but the words are unintelligible. Suddenly his eyes sprung wide open on the bed, and he began glancing around the room. Nathan appeared to be struggling, but his body didn't move. It is believed he was suffering from an episode of sleep paralysis that left him temporarily paralyzed. His eyes continued to dart rapidly around the room. Then something happened that no one who saw the video could explain. The bedroom door slowly rolled open, but the darkness of the hallway was all-consuming. Nathan's chest began frantically pumping up and down, and his eyes stretched wide open. Something was then seen moving in the hall. It could have been chalked up to a trick of the light at first, but then a hand was seen reaching through. It was gnarled and spindly, like the wretched, malformed appendage of some abyssal denizen. The figure slowly sauntered through the doorway, its tall, dark silhouette nearly grazing the top of the doorframe. It had no definite features, appearing only as a hooded, humanoid individual. No eyes or face, just a shadow made corporeal from Nathan's deepest nightmares. Poor Nathan was heard mumbling and whimpering frantically, but in his paralyzed state, he was unable to fight back or flee. He could do nothing but watch in absolute horror as the thing approached him. It stopped at the foot of his bed and just stared at him for about a minute. Nathan continued to hyperventilate and didn't appear to blink once during the entire ordeal. The thing finally moved closer. It then leaned down only a couple inches away from his face and appeared to whisper something. It was too quiet for the mic on the camera to pick up, but needless to say, it did not make Nathan feel any better about the situation. Suddenly, the thing lashed out with its twisted hands, constricting like pythons around Nathan's throat. In his paralyzed state, he couldn't even struggle against his shrouded attacker. Within a minute, Nathan's chest stopped moving, and his eyes fell still. The entity retracted its hands and just stared at him for about a minute. Then, as if taunting those who would see the footage, it looked directly into the camera. It whispered something again, but again it was too quiet to discern what it was. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it waltzed out of the room and vanished back into the darkness. Nathan was found by his wife, Janelle, a few days later, and she called the police. After an autopsy, Nathan was determined to have died via strangulation, much as was shown in the video. Cops scoured the premises and found footprints from the intruder. However, the footprints were soon matched to a pair of Nathan's own boots. The police, of course, were not so quick to believe that Nathan was simply killed by supernatural forces. They conducted interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members, but none of them seemed capable or motivated enough to have done it. There were no signs of breaking and entering, and nothing had been stolen from the home. They came to me and conducted an interview as well, but of course, that was a futile effort. I mean, sure, the fact that Janelle was my ex-girlfriend was reason enough to suspect me, but I quickly dissuaded their accusations. Nathan was my friend, despite not really being a good friend. What kind of friend boned your girlfriend behind your back anyway? I'm not bitter about it, though, at least not as far as the police are concerned. My alibis were solid, and that's good enough for them. This brings us to my final rule, rule number 11. Make sure you exhaust all other options before coming to the conclusion that your house is, in fact, haunted. If only Nathan had taken a little more time to investigate his home and himself more thoroughly, then maybe he'd still be alive today. Maybe he would have found the mini wireless speakers hidden in his attic to play the sounds of knocking. Maybe he would have found the patches in his air ducts that leaked mild doses of hallucinogenic drugs into his home. Maybe he would have detected the dog whistle alarm that caused his dogs to react so strangely. If he bothered to check himself, he may have found trace amounts of succinylcholine, a paralyzing toxin that, once ingested, will leave the person immobile yet conscious of all pain. It would have been difficult to find, as even coroners do not normally test for the substance unless specifically requested. No matter how you really slice it, this entire ordeal really comes back to Nathan himself. If only he had been a better person and not constantly demeaned his peers at every turn. If only he hadn't been so stubborn and proud. If only he hadn't gone behind my back and boned my ex-girlfriend, thus ruining our future and sending me into the spiraling depths of crippling depression. Then maybe I would have helped him. So you may be wondering, is this my confession? No, of course not. This is only my list of suggestions and rules for how things may have turned out differently for Nathan and his family. These are all hypothetical explanations and are in no way to be considered incriminating evidence to be used in court against me or anyone else, for that matter. Besides, if this really was a confession, then that would make anyone who read it an accessory to murder, and we certainly wouldn't want that. I hope you can understand that. And I do hope that we can trust each other in this regard. After all, I have really good software for tracing IPs, and the modern web makes it incredibly easy to access them. We wouldn't want your house to suddenly become haunted, now would we? Curtis held on to an unfulfilled joy for exploring. The prospect of discovering new places always enthralled him. And often, whether he was just lazing around at home, slacking off during a lecture, or just hanging out on a sober night with his friends, he would often daydream of traveling the world to diverge himself in the vast cultures of many countries. Unfortunately, he was unemployed and was still living in his hometown after 21 years. Also, he came from a lower middle-class family who couldn't afford many luxuries, especially in this lousy economy. And after all the CVs he had sent out and all the interviews he had stressed himself through, he just couldn't seem to get a full or part-time job, no matter what. He didn't have the resources to travel abroad. He couldn't even drive, so his options were limited even in his own local area. His impatience and unrest to break free from the small town to explore the world were rapidly beginning to catch up with him. So he did his best to satisfy this need by walking the dog every day. He would go to pathways and nature walks he had never taken before, explore forests and lakes that were well out of civilization's way, climb up steep hills in the countryside, and gaze around at square miles of fields, forests, and hills. If he was walking the dog through his local neighborhood, he would even go into housing estates he had never been to before, just for a change of scenery and to see what the houses there looked like. He even had a peculiar habit of estimating the demographics of estates he visited based on the type of houses they lived in and the cars they drove. Today, he decided he would walk the dog by the nearby pond. Recently, he had been frequently going to a forest a few miles out, and he hadn't walked the dog by that lake for around a fortnight now. The surroundings of the forest were starting to become all too familiar to him now, and seeing as spring had just arrived, the scenery would not be changing anytime soon. His thirst for a change of scenery was really beginning to tickle his throat. So he grabbed the leash, strapped it on to Sylvester, who heard the sounds of the leash being removed from the drawer, and in his usual response, ran eccentrically into the kitchen and headed out to the nearby pond on an unusually scorching April afternoon. He walked by the row of identical houses that he lived in, imagining taking breathtaking pictures of giant castles in Germany. After that, he walked through tufts of grass and straws of chickweed at the rusty, abandoned railway road, dreaming of drinking bourbon in a red barn with people he had just met in one of the rural states of the USA. Finally, before he crossed the road to the park where the pond was, he envisioned touring through the southern French countryside, embracing the sweet smells of France's wine country, relaxing to the sound of oars splashing the water, while slowly sailing through the rippling canals of Venice and gazing up at the empowering pyramids of ancient Egypt with the desert sun roasting his milk-pale skin and bleaching his brown curly hair. Yet when he reached the lake, it only made him depressed that he would most likely not be visiting these countries anytime soon, and frustrated at the fact that after all the painstaking job searching he had done, he was still unemployed and lacked the resources to satisfy his travel-hungry mind. Trying to ignore his annoyance and just enjoy the beautiful sunny day, he approached the section of the path that started down a short but steep hill and diverged into a left path and a right path in the shape of a bicycle. From here, he could gaze at the rippling pond, sapphire in the flourishing sun, at the flat plains that surrounded it, deceivingly emerald on this bright April, and at the fancy new private hospital that had only recently been built. Looking at the colorful, sharp design of the hospital, his attention caught the entrance to a small housing estate that was located right beside it. It was not that Curtis had never noticed this housing estate before. He had just never thought to venture into it. Walking by it all these months, he had only ever noticed two things about it: its large green area just past the entrance, which had a single sycamore tree sprouting out from the middle, and the center road, from which all other lanes in the estate emerged like branches from that tree. The main road of the estate had also been a hill, although its steepness had been rather more subtle than the sharp drop of the hill on which he was standing right now. Curtis wondered whether the houses all looked different, or if they all looked the same. Perhaps there were sections of this estate where the houses all looked the same in their own individual sections, but the designs of these housing sections were all unique. He wondered what brand of cars the neighborhood in general owned, what their gardens looked like, and perhaps he could get a glimpse into the inside of their houses. Gathering all this information, he could try to guess what kind of people lived in this estate. He yanked Sylvester's leash and trotted down the left path of the steep hill. He crossed a small stone bridge over one of the streams that fed into the pond, took the path around the large, circular plain surrounding the pond, and started walking on the footpath beside the road. He continued walking until he was directly opposite the entrance, waited for the two oncoming cars on either side of the road to pass, and jogged quickly across the road when the second car had driven by. Imitating Curtis, Sylvester sprinted ahead of him in a sudden burst of excitement. Walberton Park was etched into a sparkling light gray boulder in all capitals, which sat on a small patch of grass on the corner of the road. There were 3 houses on either side of the road at the entrance, and all 6 of them were small, white, 2-story houses. After the houses, there was a crossroads. On both the left and right turns, there were 7 medium-sized, 2-story red brick houses on either side of the streets, totaling 34 houses at the entrance. The road continued on to a T-junction at the very back of the estate, and there, the right street was about equal in length to the 2 streets at the entrance, and the left street was much longer than the rest of them. The houses on both of these streets were nearly twice as big as the houses at the entrance. All houses were on one side, while the other side was a field separated by a line of old large oak trees. They all had 2 main parts to them. One was a white 2-story, while the other was a brown dormer bungalow. There were 4 of these houses on the right street and another 10 on the left street. Before that, there were 2 green areas between the crossroads and the houses at the T-junction. One was the clean-kept, well-maintained green area with the large sycamore tree spurting out from the middle that Curtis had always seen, whereas the other was a shaggy, overgrown green area with a swing set and a slide, surrounded by 3 gray concrete walls. Curtis had never noticed this area before, despite all the times he had walked by it. While Curtis was walking down the street, observing the 10 large white and brown houses, something odd occurred to him. As nice as this estate was, it was eerily quiet, and from what he had seen so far, it was totally deserted. Of course, there was nothing wrong with these quiet estates. In fact, if Curtis had noticed groups of hyper children playing around here, he would more likely have shied away from coming here in the first place. However, Curtis had not seen a single soul. No children out playing around the sycamore tree or on the swings. No middle-aged people sitting on their sofas watching television, or even any senior citizens out gardening, basking in the glorious sunshine. The quiet wasn't just attributed to the absence of people out and about, though. Curtis couldn't even hear any cars driving on the main road he had crossed to get here or on the road, which he knew was beyond the fields and rows of tall oak trees. He didn't hear the trees sway in the wind or even hear any birds tweeting. All he could hear was his own footsteps and the ringing of Sylvester's collar as he trotted alongside him. Curtis reached the end of the cul-de-sac, turned around, and decided to have a look at the 4 houses down on the other side of the estate. While walking, he looked up at the trees, swaying silently in the brisk spring wind. He noticed that gray clouds were beginning to quickly accumulate in what he guessed was a west-southwest direction. He checked the time on his phone. It was 15:30 exactly. He decided that he had enough time to take a look around the remaining streets of the housing estate before making his way back home before 4 o'clock. When Curtis reached the top of the right street, it looked as if the 4 houses here were exactly the same as the 10 he had just observed. This street was slightly curved, however, so he continued walking just to make sure that he wasn't going to miss anything. Slowly, the hidden remnants of the last 2 houses emerged from behind the front 2 houses, and to his disappointment, Curtis found that they were in fact just the same as all 12 other houses at the back of this estate. This anticlimax, however, was short-lived, as almost immediately Curtis noticed a sharp right turn just after the last house. Quickening his pace, he observed that this newfound section was identical to the 2 streets of 2-story red brick houses at the entrance of the estate. Curtis looked back at his phone. 15:41. He walked forward, looking at the Volvo parked in the driveway of the first house on the right, and was then halted unexpectedly. Dazed for a very brief moment, he turned around to find Sylvester sitting down, all 4 of his paws pressed into the concrete. Curtis jerked on the leash twice more, urging Sylvester to walk on with him. "Come on, boy. Simon. Come on. Silver. Come on." Sylvester continued to sit stubbornly, staring solemnly at Curtis with those wide, watery brown eyes. Curtis stared at him, defeated. Had Sylvester been a Chihuahua, a Jack Russell, or even a King Charles, he could have dragged him down the street easily enough. But he was a well-fed, sturdy Weimaraner, who Curtis knew would have put up a tough fight. Curtis whipped the leash up in the air feebly. Then Sylvester sprang to a stand with his ears pricked and followed Curtis away from the street of the hidden 14 houses. Curtis led Sylvester to what looked like a young ash tree growing amidst the old, looming oak trees. He tied the leash around it and bent down to rub Sylvester reassuringly. Sylvester tried to lick at his face and sprang at Curtis as he walked down the street away from him, but was jerked back by the tight knot that secured him to the tree. Trying his best to avoid the guilt from Sylvester's puppy eyes, Curtis walked along the middle of the road, glancing at all the red brick houses without looking back. All houses appeared to be in good condition on the outside, although a few had messy, unkempt gardens. Curtis counted 6 of these gardens, 5 of which had at least one children's toy recklessly skewed about somewhere. It reminded Curtis of the uncomfortable, empty, overgrown green area with the cheap slide and swing set near the entrance of the estate. The remaining gardens had their edges and corners blemished with haphazard bunches of flowers, their colors vividly clashing yet relievingly soothing to the eye. Their lawns were flat and fresh spring green, and one or two had a few rust-colored tiles matching their red brick house, just as a cherry on top. Curtis reached the end of the cul-de-sac, marked by a mossy, gray concrete wall with long green grass at its bottom corner that towered at what Curtis assumed was at least 15 feet tall. Following it up to the top, Curtis noticed that the sky was completely overcast, with thick, light gray altostratus clouds. Fearing the small risk of rain, Curtis decided it was best to head home straight after this, also deciding to observe the types of cars on his way out. Looking around at a few Volkswagens and Hondas, and remembering that one Volvo at the very first house on the right, which was now the very last on the left, Curtis looked for the car at the house directly opposite that one. While doing so, the same eerie thought from before struck him from out of nowhere. While it was weird enough to have absolutely no human activity on one stretch of housing in this estate, it was getting all too unnerving now for him that there were no people on this street either. Again, there were no children playing, no elderly gardening, and not even anyone sitting in their front rooms, from what Curtis could remember. While approaching the left turn back onto the street at the back of the estate, Curtis noticed something stark that made him halt and recoil in swift panic. Sylvester was gone. Kurt's muscles intensified. He was breathing heavily, immediately sprinting, profusely panicking, and cursing himself for leaving the dog all by himself. "Sylvester, here, boy, come here, Silver," he said loudly and desperately while running at a sharp pace. He whistled 3 times and loudly called for him again. "Here, Silver, Silver, Sylvester. Come on, boy." He was approaching the turn when he began to shout for him, straining the muscles in his dry throat. "Sylvester, Sylvester, Sil." His shouting was brought to a halt as sudden confusion washed away Kurt's fretting. He should have been running on the road between the oak trees and the large brown and white houses. However, unease was tingling down Kurt's spine as he looked around at the red brick houses, standing only a few feet away from the tall, mossy, gray concrete wall that marked the end of the street he had just turned away from. Curtis was anxious, wondering how he had just unexpectedly hallucinated or daydreamed about that whole fiasco. But as he looked back up to the top of the street, Curtis saw once more that Sylvester was nowhere to be found. Curtis sprinted again, his thoughts a little more collected, and his worries were briefly pushed aside. As he approached the turn for the second time, Curtis noticed that the leech was also missing, signaling to him that someone had found Sylvester, and he looked around at the red brick houses, standing only a few feet away from the tall, mossy, gray concrete wall that marked the end of the street he had just turned away from. Curtis was frightened. He had definitely not hallucinated that. "If I had, why would I be panting so much?" he thought to himself. He sprinted once more, faster than the previous 2 times. He was fatigued, but he kept himself motivated by his desire to break free from the seemingly infinite maze. He was thinking to himself again, perhaps if I just try to glimpse at the white paint of the house around the corner. He looked around at the red brick houses, standing only a few feet away from the tall, mossy, gray concrete wall that marked the end of the street he had just turned away from. He was dreaming. He trembled fiercely and glanced around frantically, feeling like he was going to go blind if he stared at one thing for more than 3 seconds. His energy was absent from all the running, but he kept walking, doing so rapidly while swirling his vision around in circles, his only motivation being fear and despair. The ash tree that Sylvester was tied to jumped back and lurched toward him every few seconds, like his rapidly beating pulse. His shaky legs attempted to pick up a jog once more. Trying to glimpse one of the white houses again, he peered intensely through any gaps, blotches appearing quickly in his central vision, while his outer vision blurred. When he couldn't find even a hint of white housing in any gap anywhere on this street, Curtis clutched his head into his hand. flailing his legs into a chaotic run towards the left turn, only hanging onto a thread of hope. He looked around at the red brick houses, standing only a few feet away from the tall, mossy, gray concrete wall that marked the end of the street he had just turned away from. Curtis lay down on the cold concrete in the shape of a fetus, burying his face into the warm, dark depths of his palms, his emotions latent on his pale, blank face apart from the wordless tears that gushed from his hazel eyes. He unintentionally scratched his brown, curly hair against the harsh surface of the road, refusing to look at any of his surroundings. Curtis was surrounded by unchanging scenery and total, maddening silence. There was not a single soul to share or polarize his never-ending suffering. Hundreds of dead arms slowly materialized from beneath the nucleated evergreen trees where Curtis had submerged himself. Rotting flesh, crusty and glistening, the color of mixed pale gray and deep blue from all floors of the houses, behind the numerous windows in all the large white and brown houses, bodies of pale gray and faces of deep blue, with large circular black eyes, thin, stitched lips, and noseless faces, scratched softly at the window, sometimes drumming all 5 fingers on the glass. You couldn't hear the sound, but the vibration left an echo in your chest, an echo so dense it was like a protected kick from a startled horse. Their vacant eyes spoke the messages that the muscles of their stitched mouths struggled to comprehend. Sylvester snarled at the slow-moving arms and barked viciously at the dead-eyed children emerging from the sewer. Sylvester whined for Curtis to return, and with every passing minute, the sky turned an even deeper orange. Sylvester pulled full force away from the black, dying tree. Each leaf that fell onto his back was scorching him. The deceased children swayed from side to side, slowly moving in on helpless Sylvester. Not a sound could be heard from anywhere as Sylvester violently shook the leash that had bound him. Sylvester snarled and barked viciously once more in a futile effort to intimidate the emotionless, dead children still swaying slowly toward him. Sylvester turned away from them and then towards the tree. He walked backwards until the leash was at its most strained. Then he shook his head rapidly from side to side, tightening the grip of all 4 paws that were submerged in the muck. Slowly, the leash began to slide over his neck, the nylon scraping painfully at the back of his ears. The ball in his throat became rapidly swollen as he struggled to breathe with the collar wrapped so tightly around it. The heavy friction made the collar slip past his ears extremely slowly. He was awfully anxious about the emotionless, dead children swaying toward him painfully slowly. His vision blurred when his head jerked violently back and when the air flooded back into his lungs. The moment he released himself, a pale gray arm swung toward him, and their rust-colored, razor-sharp nails dug past his thin silver coat and into the soft, tender flesh just above his hip. Sylvester yelped, then snarled and barked mercilessly at the noseless, stitched mouth, void-eyed, dead child, sinking his teeth into their ice-cold flesh. The child stalled and pulled away, leaving just enough time for Sylvester to dash away from them. He galloped left, down the subtly steep hill. The orange sky swirled like a gyroscope right above him. But Sylvester never looked back once. He galloped towards the entrance, where a slit of light shone blindingly bright in the dead center. Surrounding the blinding light, there was nothing but total darkness. The pale gray, deep blue bodies of men, women, and children hung, gloomy and still, from the thickest branch of the withering, black, dying sycamore tree. Sylvester stopped to snarl and bark at the dissolving children sitting on the swings and the eyeless men and women drumming their fingers on the windows of the small white houses at the entrance. Sylvester continued running and running and running, running towards the blindingly bright light until that was all he could see. At that moment, the entire world seemed to shift entirely to one side, while Sylvester could see nothing but blindingly bright lights, hear absolutely nothing, and floated in the air, feeling gravity pull him to the left. Sylvester landed on his side with a sharp pain throbbing just above his hip and a dull burning sensation all over his back. He barked a few times while his vision spun around dizzily in his mind. A few seconds later, after he rubbed at his eyes with both his front paws, Sylvester looked around him curiously, readying his teeth to snarl. Families of smiling adults and playful children were walking around the lakes with their noses and eyes intact and their mouths unstitched. Cars were driving on the roads, and the sounds of birds tweeting and ducks quacking still echoed through the beautiful, sunny April afternoon. Sylvester loosened his jaw and started to pant. All that was missing was Curtis.